Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the fascinating currents of human behavior and bring to the core insights, often from unexpected places. Today, we're tackling a question that, well, on the surface, feels incredibly counterintuitive. Why do people sometimes fail to act when others are in distress, especially when there are lots of witnesses present? You'd think more eyes would mean more help, not less. It just doesn't quite add up, does it?
It really doesn't. It's a paradox that has puzzled psychologists and, frankly, gripped headlines for decades now. What we're talking about, of course, is the bystander effect. Sometimes it's also called bystander apathy, although, as we'll probably get into, apathy might not be the right word. It might be a bit of a misnomer.
Right. Apathy implies not caring, which might not be the full picture.
Exactly. So in its simplest form, it describes this thing where the more witnesses there are to an emergency, the less likely any single witness is to step in and help the person who needs it. It's truly counterintuitive because, like you said, our gut feeling, our assumption is that a bigger group means a safety net, right? Not a barrier to actually helping.
Absolutely. And the core of this paradox seems to be that the more witnesses, the less individual responsibility is felt by anyone there. It's almost like the responsibility just gets diluted, spread thin across the crowd.
Yeah, diffused.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really pull back the curtain on the fascinating psychology behind this whole thing. We're going to look at its maybe surprising origins, the groundbreaking research that first really showed its mechanisms. It's sometimes chilling, real-world examples, and even the tricky ethical and legal sides of it. We pulled together a stack of sources, articles, key research papers, case studies, basically, to give you a shortcut to being really well-informed on this crucial bit of human behavior.
And it's not just about understanding a psychological term, as important as that is. It's really about understanding ourselves, isn't it? The complex social dynamics that shape how we act in groups, the social fabric we all live in. What is it that triggers an action, even when something seems really obvious? And on the flip side, what makes someone actually intervene? How do these subtle, often subconscious social pressures work in these crisis moments? Do we step up or do we stay quiet? We're going to explore all of that today. The goal is to give you a really comprehensive and hopefully nuanced understanding.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our journey into the bystander effect. It doesn't actually start in a psychology lab. It starts with a really unsettling event from the mid-'60s, an event that, well, even though we now know the initial reporting wasn't entirely accurate, it absolutely shocked the world. And it became this pivotal moment, the catalyst for decades of research into exactly this area.
Indeed. We're talking about the Kitty Genovese case, March 1964. The story that went wide, the sensationalized version, painted this truly horrifying picture of city life, of urban indifference. The New York Times, other big papers, they reported how Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her apartment in Queens, New York. And the really shocking headline grabber was that 38 witnesses supposedly watched, over quite a long time apparently, as she was attacked. And the story was, they didn't intervene, didn't even call the police.
Just watched.
That was the narrative. And presented like that as this stark, almost unbelievable example of collective apathy. Well, it caused huge public outrage. Disbelief, really, across the country. It seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears about modern cities, anonymous, cold, uncaring.
Yeah, it's horrifying to even imagine. That idea that so many people could witness something so awful and just do nothing. It felt like an indictment of humanity itself. But this is where it gets really interesting and adds that crucial layer of nuance. It's a real aha moment for understanding how stories, how narratives can shape our perception of reality. Later on, more thorough investigations, by journalists, historians, they found that the initial story was actually quite exaggerated. It wasn't the full picture.
How so?
Well, while many residents definitely heard screaming, many didn't actually see the full attack happening. That made it ambiguous for them. Was it a couple fighting? A drunken argument?
The ambiguity factor we might discuss later.
Exactly. That uncertainty was key. And crucially, it turned out that some people did call the police. At least two, maybe more. And some others even tried to intervene indirectly, like shouting from their windows to try and scare the attacker off.
Okay, so not the clean, simple story of 38 silent watchers. That's a critical distinction, isn't it? But the initial dramatic story, even though it was flawed in the details, it had this undeniable, profound impact. It just captured the public imagination. Maybe more than a more accurate but less dramatic version would have. It became this powerful modern myth, almost a cautionary tale about city life and moral decay.
So what does this all mean for our deep dives today? Even with those factual inaccuracies, the exact number of witnesses, what they saw, who called, who the Genovese case was still this undeniable catalyst. It wasn't just a grim headline. It directly sparked huge amounts of psychological research into bystander behavior. It made scientists ask rigorously, why does this inaction happen? Under what conditions? And furthermore, and this is a really significant societal change tied directly to the emotional fallout from the case, the public outcry, the perceived communication failures, even helped lead to the creation of the 911 emergency system in the U.S.
Oh, I didn't realize the link was that direct.
Yeah. It shows how a powerful story, even one that's not perfectly accurate, can drive massive societal change. Sometimes, like with 9/11, for the better in terms of public safety.
Okay, so from that really shocking anecdote, however impactful it was, the scientific community felt this need to move beyond just stories and speculation. They needed a rigorous empirical study, and this is exactly where two pioneering psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latané, came in. This was in the late 1960s. They realized that just relying on anecdotal evidence, which, can be biased, incomplete, and it's hard to reconstruct exactly what happened in a chaotic emergency, it just wasn't enough.
Right. You need controlled conditions.
Exactly. So their really clever approach was to take the big questions raised by the Genovese case and move them into the lab, into controlled settings. Their goal was to scientifically observe how people behaved in simulated emergencies, to try and understand the underlying mechanisms behind inaction.
And their methods were pretty ingenious, weren't they? Simple but effective. They designed these clever experiments to manipulate specific things, isolate the conditions that made people help or not help. For instance, in one of their most famous studies, they had participants believe they were in a group discussion about personal problems over intercoms to maintain anonymity. But the participants didn't know the other people were actually just pre-recorded voices.
Oh, okay. Setting the stage.
Yeah. And during this discussion, one of the pre-recorded voices would simulate having a severe epileptic seizure. Really clear signs of distress, stuttering, gasping, crying for help, becoming incoherent. It was designed to be unmistakably an emergency.
And they didn't just stop at seizures. They tried other things too, right? To make sure it wasn't just about that specific type of emergency.
Exactly. In other variations, they had different scenarios. Like, one involved a room that would slowly start filling up with smoke. Kind of ambiguous, potentially dangerous. You had to decide if it was serious. Another one, simpler, involved hearing a woman in apparent distress in another room. Maybe she fell, cried out in pain.
Okay, different types of emergencies, but what was the key thing they were changing?
The key manipulation, the variable in all these carefully designed experiments, was whether the participant believed they were the only one who knew about the emergency, or if they thought other people were also present and aware. That was the crucial difference.
So isolating the effect of the perceived group size.
Precisely. It let Darley and Latané directly test how just thinking others were around affected whether someone would step in and how quickly.
And the results, were they as clear as the Genovese story suggested?
Oh, the results were stark. Absolutely stark. They undeniably cemented the bystander effect as a measurable, scientifically proven thing. When participants believed they were the only witness totally alone with the person in distress, about 85% helped, and helped quickly, often within seconds.
85%, that's high. That shows the impulse to help is strong when the responsibility is clear.
Exactly. But here's where the invisible crowd, as you called it, makes its impact felt. When they thought others were also aware of the emergency, sharing that potential responsibility helping plummeted dramatically, down to around 31%.
Wow, 85 down to 31. Just by thinking other people were there.
Yeah, think about that. Just believing others were present cut the likelihood of someone helping by more than half.
And the beta was really consistent across the different scenarios they tested. It was powerful empirical support for their ideas. It's a colossal drop. And to put an even finer point on it, remember that scenario with the woman in distress. In that one, 70% helped when they thought they were alone with her. Makes sense. But when just one other stranger was also present, just one other person, notionally cutting responsibility from 100% to 50%, the helping rate fell to only 40%.
70 down to 40 with just one other person, that shows how quickly that sense of individual accountability just evaporates.
It really does.
So what's truly fascinating here is how these controlled experiments gave real solid evidence for what the Genovese case only hinted at, right? It took the idea from being a shocking news story and, well, speculation, into a scientifically validated psychological principle. It showed pretty unequivocally that the mere belief that others are present fundamentally changes our likelihood to act. And importantly, it suggests it's not necessarily about being indifferent or lacking empathy. It's about how the social context, the situation itself, can literally rewire our immediate response in a crisis, pushing us towards inaction. Okay, so now we've got the evidence for what the bystander effect is and how it shows up in controlled settings. The big question, the crucial one, is why? Why does this happen? Darley and Latané didn't just stop at observing the effect. They went on to identify 3 core psychological factors they believed were driving it, explaining the why behind this puzzling inaction. Let's dive into those.
Right. The first one, and maybe the most intuitive, is diffusion of responsibility. This is the idea that when there are multiple people around in an emergency, individuals tend to assume someone else will act. Or maybe someone else is more qualified to act. This assumption effectively lowers their own feeling of personal duty to step in.
It's like everyone in the room is thinking, surely someone else will handle this. I don't need to be the one.
Exactly. The burden of taking action doesn't fall squarely on any one person's shoulders anymore. It gets spread out, diffused across the group, and often it gets spread so thin that no single person feels that strong urge, that personal imperative to actually do something.
And the source material we looked at really emphasizes that this effect gets stronger, exponentially so, with larger groups. The more people there are, the more diluted that feeling of personal responsibility becomes. If you're one of 2 people, maybe you feel, I don't know, 50% responsible. But if you're one of 50, that percentage shrinks dramatically in your mind, almost to 0. Makes it much easier to rationalize not acting.
It's a bit like that classic group project scenario, isn't it? Where everyone kind of assumes someone else will do the hard parts, pick up the slack, and then sometimes crucial things get left undone because no single person took ownership. Same principle, but with potentially much higher stakes.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so diffusion of responsibility is number 1. What's the second factor?
The second key factor is pluralistic ignorance. This one's a bit more subtle, but just as powerful, especially when the situation isn't crystal clear. It happens when we look around and interpret a situation as not being urgent simply because nobody else seems to be reacting. Even if, privately, deep down, we think maybe it is urgent, we tend to conform to the group's inaction or silence. We might think, well, everyone else looks calm. Maybe I'm the only one worried. Maybe I'm overreacting, or I've totally misunderstood what's going on.
So it becomes this kind of vicious cycle, a social cue problem. We naturally look to others for clues on how to behave, right? Especially when things are ambiguous or uncertain and we don't know the right response. And if everyone else is also looking around, seeing nobody else reacting, well, that collective inaction just reinforces itself. Nobody wants to be the odd one out, make a scene, or be wrong publicly.
Precisely. This mechanism is particularly relevant in those ambiguous scenarios. Is that person slumped on the bench just sleeping, or have they collapsed? Is that shouting an argument or real distress? The less clear it is, the more we rely on those social cues, which can lead everyone down the path of inaction together.
Okay, that makes sense. Diffusion of responsibility, pluralistic ignorance. What is the third one?
And finally, the third factor Darley and Latané identified is evaluation apprehension. This is basically the fear of social judgment, the fear of looking foolish that stops us from acting. People worry they'll embarrass themselves or seem like they're overreacting if they step in and it turns out they misread the situation, especially in public.
So you're standing there thinking, what if it's nothing serious? What if I rush over and they're fine and everyone just stares at me like I'm an idiot or laughs? That fear of public embarrassment can be a really strong deterrent.
Exactly. There's a definite public performance aspect to it. When you're out in public, there's this added layer of self-consciousness, this feeling of being watched and potentially judged. That feeling can seriously inhibit pro-social behavior aimed at helping others. You're not just deciding whether to help, you're also weighing up how your intervention or even your non-intervention will look to everyone else. It's a complex, rapid, internal calculation.
Okay, those 3 make a lot of sense together. Diffusion of responsibility, pluralistic ignorance, evaluation apprehension. But you mentioned earlier research has evolved.
Yes, and it's important to note that while Darley and Latané brilliantly identified these 3 core factors, more recent studies tend to see them as deeply intertwined. They often operate together. And newer perspectives also bring in other psychological processes. It's not always just those 3. Some researchers now talk about the role of emotional regulation and self-avoidance.
What does that mean exactly?
It suggests that individuals might be actively, though maybe subconsciously, trying to manage uncomfortable emotions that arise in these situations, like fear, anxiety, perhaps even disgust, Or they might be trying to avoid getting involved in difficult, potentially messy or confrontational situations. So the brain rapidly calculates the potential personal cost of intervening danger, social awkwardness, maybe even legal issues down the line. And then it provides justifications for inaction, partly as a way to manage the anxiety and fear the situation provokes.
So it's a kind of self-preservation instinct.
In a way, yes, a psychological self-preservation that can often be mistaken for genuine apathy or indifference. But the underlying process might be much more about managing one's own internal state and perceived risks than about not caring for the victim.
That distinction feels really important. It shifts the focus from people don't care to people are responding to complex psychological and social pressures. Okay, so we've gone from that shocking real-world case, the Genovese story, to the lab experiments, identifying these core mechanisms: diffusion, pluralistic ignorance, evaluation, apprehension, maybe mixed with emotional regulation. But the bystander effect isn't just a lab curiosity or a historical footnote, is it? It shows up chillingly and consistently in the real world, often in big headline-grabbing incidents, but also in everyday stuff that might surprise you.
Absolutely. The ubiquity of this effect is, well, it's unsettling. We see it play out in various tragic incidents that make the news acts of violence on public transport. Those awful viral videos of assaults that circulate online where you see people filming instead of helping. But also in more insidious situations like ongoing workplace bullying or subtle forms of harassment where people see it happening but don't speak up. In all these cases, you frequently see bystanders observing wrongdoing, sometimes for a really long time without intervening. It just reinforces how real and pervasive this phenomenon is.
There was a particularly chilling recent example, wasn't there? One that really seemed to bring all these mechanisms together vividly. The 2021 SEPTA case in Philadelphia.
Yes, that was a deeply disturbing case. It unfolded on a commuter train. A passenger was harassed and then sexually assaulted, reportedly for nearly 40 minutes.
40 minutes on a train with other people around.
Yes. And the truly unsettling detail from that case, the part that makes it such a powerful modern illustration of the bystander effect, is that during that prolonged assault, other passengers were reportedly present. And they either passively watched it happen or, even more disturbingly, some apparently recorded parts of the incident on their phones. But they didn't intervene directly, nor did they immediately call 911.
Recording it instead of helping. That highlights a really terrifying digital twist on bystander behavior, doesn't it? Where documenting something awful tragically replaces trying to stop it.
It does. The footage itself became evidence of the inaction, not just the crime. It really forced a public reckoning with this phenomenon.
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around that level of inaction. But wasn't there one exception in that case?
Yes, there was. In the end, it was reportedly an off-duty transit employee who happened to be on board who finally intervened and physically pulled the assailant away. That single act of intervention really stands out in stark contrast against the backdrop of apparently widespread inaction from other passengers.
So what does that specific case teach us, looking through the lens of the psychology we've discussed?
Well, it seems to powerfully illustrate how all three mechanisms could have been playing out simultaneously in that horrible public scenario. Diffusion of responsibility. There are other people here. Surely someone else will do something. Pluralistic ignorance. Is this really happening? No one else is reacting strongly. Maybe it's not as bad as it looks. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Coupled perhaps with the ambiguity of a moving train environment. And evaluation apprehension. What if I intervene and get hurt? What if I make things worse? What will people think if I jump in? Perhaps for that one off-duty employee, their professional role, their training, maybe instilled a stronger, non-negotiable sense of individual responsibility that overrode those powerful social pressures that might have paralyzed others.
Makes you wonder. And you also mentioned something called institutional bystanding. What's that about? It's not just individuals.
Right. The bystander effect isn't just about individual people failing to act in a specific moment. We can also see something similar happen at an organizational or systemic level. Think about situations involving systemic abuse, like some cases reported in Myanmar. There, you had instances where hospital staff, social workers, various agencies apparently suspected widespread cruelty or harm was occurring. But collectively, as institutions, they failed to act decisively or report effectively.
So it's like pluralistic ignorance, but within an organization.
Exactly. It mirrors that dynamic. Different departments or individuals within the system might see parts of the problem, but perhaps assume it's someone else's responsibility, or they hesitate to raise alarms due to internal politics or fear of repercussions. This can lead to a kind of systemic paralysis, where a collective failure to acknowledge or respond allows widespread harm to continue unchecked. It raises a really important question. What happens when entire organizations or even governments become the bystanders? How does that scale up the problem and the potential harm?
That's a sobering thought. And it's not just adults or complex organizations. This stuff shows up even earlier.
Surprisingly, yes. The underlying mechanisms seem to be present even among children. In schools, for example, researchers have observed kids holding back from helping, like stepping in when someone's being bullied. And the reasons they give often echo the bystander effect principles. Embarrassment, evaluation apprehension, wanting to distance themselves from a difficult situation, self-avoidance, or just going along with what the peer group does or doesn't do, conforming to norms related to pluralistic ignorance.
So a kid sees a classmate being picked on. They might feel bad, want to help, but the fear of getting picked on themselves, or maybe just looking uncool or breaking unspoken peer rules, that can be incredibly powerful and lead to inaction.
Precisely. It shows how deeply ingrained these social and psychological factors seem to be. It's not necessarily something we consciously learn. It feels more like an inherent social response pattern that actually requires conscious effort and maybe courage to overcome.
Okay, so we understand the effect, the mechanisms, how it plays out for individuals and even institutions, young and old. But it's not inevitable, right? Are there things, specific factors that can actually shift the odds? Make intervention more likely instead of less likely?
Yes, absolutely. Research has identified several key variables, specific conditions, that can significantly influence whether a bystander steps up and becomes what some people call an upstander, rather than remaining passive.
Okay, let's look at those. What can change the bystander equation? You mentioned ambiguity earlier.
Right, ambiguity is a huge one. If a situation is unclear, if it's open to interpretation, bystanders are much more likely to hesitate, delay action, or simply misinterpret how urgent it really is. Is that person clutching their chest having a heart attack, or did they just eat something spicy? Is that couple arguing playfully, or is it escalating into violence? That uncertainty is paralyzing.
Because if you're unsure, you look around for cues.
Exactly. The less clear the emergency, the more room there is for pluralistic ignorance to take hold. If it's not screamingly obvious that help is needed, people look to others. And if everyone else is also looking around, confused and hesitant, then inaction becomes the perceived norm, reinforcing itself. The data even suggests a quantifiable delay. It might take up to 5 times longer for someone to respond in an ambiguous situation compared to a clear-cut emergency.
5 times longer. That could be critical.
Absolutely critical. Think about it. A clear emergency might get a response in, say, 10 seconds. An ambiguous one. That response might be delayed by almost a minute. In a medical crisis or an assault, every second counts. It can literally be the difference between life and death. It shows how quickly uncertainty, amplified by reliance on others' action, can become a silent accomplice.
Okay, so clarity helps. What else? Group size, we touched on that.
Yes, group size is fundamental, so it's worth hitting again. As more people are present, that diffusion of responsibility just intensifies. It's pretty much a direct relationship. The bigger the crowd, the more diluted that individual feeling of accountability gets. It really underscores the core paradox we started with.
More people, less likely you are to help.
Exactly. And this leads to that crucial inverse truth. One person alone is significantly more likely to act. When there's literally no one else to share the burden of responsibility with, the individual feels the full weight of the situation. Intervention becomes far more probable. That's a key takeaway. Individual responsibility peaks when there's no one else to pass the buck to, psychologically speaking. If you're the only one there, you know it's on you.
Makes sense. So clarity of the situation, smaller group size. What else influences intervention?
The third key area is cohesion and status. This is about the relationships within the group of bystanders. There's definitely power and connection. Groups that are familiar or cohesive, think friends, family members, maybe even close colleagues. They are generally more likely to intervene together compared to a group of complete strangers.
Why is that?
Well, there tends to be a stronger sense of shared responsibility, maybe a pre-existing norm of looking out for each other, and likely less evaluation apprehension. You're probably less worried about looking foolish in front of people you know well, and you might have a deeper investment in their well-being and how the group responds collectively.
Okay, so knowing the other bystanders helps. But you mentioned status. How does that play in? Can it work the other way?
It can, and this is where it gets complicated. Hierarchies, or certain kinds of peer pressure, can, paradoxically, suppress helping, even in groups that know each other. For example, think about a workplace with a clear power dynamic. A junior employee might see a senior manager doing something questionable, maybe unethical or unsafe. Even if they know it's wrong, they might hesitate to speak up or intervene because they fear repercussions, damaging their career, or just violating the unspoken rules of the hierarchy.
Ah, so the fear of negative consequences from someone with higher status overrides the urge to help or do the right thing.
Exactly. Or think about peer pressure among teenagers. Even if a group of friends witnesses something like bullying, the desire to fit in, or the fear of being ostracized by the dominant members of the group can stop individuals from intervening, even if they privately disapprove. So it's fascinating how these dynamics of power, social standing, or intricate peer relationships can sometimes override even established bonds or general willingness to help. Adds another complex layer of social influence.
So we've really mapped out the psychological territory of the bystander effect, uncovered these complex mechanisms. But its impact goes beyond just psychology labs or individual choices, doesn't it? It seems to touch on how we think about ethics and even how our legal systems work. It really moves into broader societal questions.
Absolutely. The broader implications are significant, especially when you look at that intersection of law and morality. For example, it's been noted that in some South African courts, defense lawyers in murder cases have actually brought up concepts like group conformity and diffusion of responsibility. They've used them as part of the context, as potential mitigating factors for individuals who were present during a crime but didn't actively participate or intervene.
Wow. So bystander psychology isn't just academic theory. It's actually being argued in courtrooms, influencing how guilt or culpability might be assigned in really serious cases.
It seems so in some contexts, and it raises a really important, difficult question for society. How much should our understanding of these powerful psychological forces mitigate individual responsibility when something terrible happens? It's a complex ethical tightrope, isn't it? Balancing our scientific understanding of human behavior against society's fundamental need for accountability and justice.
That's a profound point, using psychology to explain, though maybe not excuse, behavior in the eyes of the law. And perhaps in direct response to the bystander effect and the challenge it poses to safety, some places have actually brought in specific laws, haven't they? Duty to rescue laws.
Yes, that's right. Some countries and jurisdictions have enacted what are often called duty to rescue or failure to assist laws. These laws essentially create a legal obligation for bystanders to take some action, often, at a minimum, calling for professional help like dialing 911 or the local equivalent if they witness someone in serious peril, provided they can do so without endangering themselves.
Which countries have these?
Examples include places like France, Germany, Russia, and some U.S. states like Minnesota and Vermont have versions of these laws too. The specifics vary, but the general idea is similar. Often, failing to assist when you safely could is treated as a misdemeanor.
So this is a direct legal attempt to fight back against that psychological inertia, using the threat of legal consequences to push people towards intervention.
Exactly. It's intended as a legal countermeasure. The idea is that if you're legally compelled to act, maybe the fear of legal penalty will outweigh the psychological barriers like diffusion of responsibility or evaluation apprehension. It tries to shift the calculation, making inaction legally risky, not just socially or psychologically uncomfortable.
But does it work? That sparks a really interesting discussion point, doesn't it? Can laws actually change these deep-seated psychological tendencies? And what about the ethics of it? Are we mandating altruism? Does forcing someone to help actually foster genuine civic responsibility? Or does it just create a fear of getting caught not helping?
Those are the crucial questions. It brings up fundamental debates about societal expectations versus individual liberty and the real limits of what legislation can achieve in shaping complex human behavior. Some argue that true heroism, genuine altruism, has to come from free will, not legal coercion. Others argue that society has a right, even a duty, to demand a basic level of pro-social behavior, a minimum standard of care for fellow citizens in emergencies. It's an ongoing debate with valid points on both sides.
Yeah, it really moves us beyond just understanding the phenomenon to thinking actively about how we, as a society, can encourage people to help each other. How do we build systems or norms that promote that sense of shared responsibility instead of letting it just diffuse away?
That's the challenge. It might involve things like public awareness campaigns, education about the bystander effect itself, maybe specific training programs like first aid or intervention techniques. Even the design of our public spaces could play a role. Maybe encouraging more interaction and reducing anonymity could help counter some of these effects.
And that brings us towards the end of our deep dive today. We've really unpacked the bystander effect, haven't we? From its, well, controversial origins with the Kitty Genovese case, remembering the important nuance about how that story was initially told through, to the profound psychological underpinnings identified by Darley and Latané, and seeing its undeniable, sometimes quite chilling, presence in our world, both in dramatic events and subtle ways. We've seen that inaction isn't necessarily indifference. Often it's this complex interplay of diffusion of responsibility, pluralistic ignorance, and evaluation apprehension. And maybe, as recent research suggests, it's also tied into how we manage our own emotions and avoid difficult situations that self-preservation kicking in.
So, what does all this mean for you, our listener, taking this all in? Well, understanding these mechanisms isn't just trivia. It's not just academic knowledge. It's really about becoming more aware, more conscious of these powerful social forces that can influence your own behavior and the behavior of people around you in critical moments. This knowledge is a tool. It's a lens you can use to view not just emergencies, but maybe everyday situations too. Think about meetings at work, online interactions, community issues where collective inaction might let problems slide or harm persist. Just knowing about these psychological traps, like diffusion of responsibility, that's genuinely the first step toward avoiding falling into them yourself.
Right. And knowing how easily we can fall prey to that invisible crowd, that potent, silent pressure pushing us towards doing nothing, how can we consciously make the choice to be the one who steps forward? If you do find yourself in a crowd witnessing distress, you can use this knowledge proactively. You can consciously cut through the ambiguity and the diffusion. Like instead of just shouting, "Someone call 911," point directly at a specific person. You, in the blue shirt, call 911 now. By singling someone out, assigning direct responsibility, you immediately break that spell of diffusion.
That's a great practical tip. Or if you're unsure about an ambiguous situation, maybe you can be the one to take that first small step, just asking directly, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" That simple question can cut through pluralistic ignorance. It forces clarity and can often be enough to get the ball rolling, either confirming help is needed or resolving the ambiguity.
So it raises this final provocative thought for you to take away. In a world where collective action is so often needed, whether it's for big societal issues or just helping someone on the street, and knowing how easily our own psychology can lead us towards inaction. What personal responsibility do we each hold? How can we cultivate the awareness, maybe the courage, to be an upstander in a world full of potential bystanders?
How do we intentionally disrupt these patterns, not just in ourselves, but maybe helping disrupt them in the groups we're part of, to try and ensure that when someone genuinely needs help, help is actually consistently and swiftly given? It's definitely a question worth mulling over long after this deep dive ends.